As we do start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Kulin Nation and Michael from Ngunnawal country. We extend our respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their care of country and waters. And we extend that respect to all our First Nations listeners. We all know that everybody needs a sustainable supply of safe water for cleaning, for drinking, cooking. It's a basic human right. We also know that for millions of people around the world, that isn't their reality. A story for me that really brings that into a human story is from visiting Papua New Guinea a number of years ago. I was lucky enough to be visiting a community where WaterAid and our partners had been working, and we were launching a simple gravity-fed scheme that was going to transform the lives of that community. And I was walking around that community with a grandmother called Dorothy. She came up to about my shoulder, but had an incredible energy about her with her silver hair and a sparkler in her eye. She showed me the tap that was outside her home. And as she turned on that water, she also teared up a bit. And she looked at me and she said, "Rosie, I never imagined that I would see this in my lifetime." In this episode, we are going to be speaking to two people working to change this reality on the ground to bring our goal of universal access to water and sanitation closer to a reality. Navara and Alison, welcome to the podcast.
Water scarcity and water security challenges are growing at an unprecedented pace, affecting billions of people globally. The United Nations has said that in over 300 locations, we can expect to see conflict over water by 2025. This is exacerbated by continuing population growth and the impacts of climate change. So what happens if we do nothing? My name is Rachel Mason-Nunn, founder of Goodwill Hunters. This series is brought to you with support from the Australian Water Partnership. As a Water for Development initiative supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Australian Water Partnership mobilises Australia's internationally recognised expertise to drive action towards sustainable water management in our region and beyond. We're so glad you can join us for this crucial conversation on our shared global water future this winter on Goodwill Hunters.
Navara, you've had a really diverse professional life, and a pretty fascinating one at that. You started off studying psychology and then you went and worked in the private sector. Now you lead water rights programming in Papua New Guinea. Can I start by asking, how did you end up working on water?
Thanks, Michael. How did I end up working in water? Well, for me, my interest has always been working in development. So I guess, as what you mentioned, my journey through the development field probably started in 2006 when I started with Family Health International. That was working with more, health-related HIV/AIDS and STIs. But like for me, development there's so many different ways to look at development. So essentially, if you're working in health, education, you're somehow contributing to development. So I guess my passion has always been to work in the development space. And I was just fortunate enough to land, with WaterAid when the opportunity came up in 2019 to work in, directly in water sanitation and hygiene. So before that, I had some experience working with water sanitation hygiene more at a broader development level. But now, I've been fortunate to be able to work directly in water sanitation and hygiene, where you are still contributing to the development of the country, even more so, water being a really essential part, water sanitation and hygiene being such an essential part of development. It's just that opportunity to, work in that space. So, my passion is development, and water sanitation hygiene just happens to be one, key part of development that I've been fortunate enough to land in that space. Yeah.
Amazing, Navara. WaterAid's so lucky to have you, and it's fantastic, hearing your passion for development and the role that water and sanitation plays in that. And Alison, for you, I mean, you've also had an incredibly diverse career that has often focused on water and the environment. As I understand it, your first role was in Indonesia in 1997, working on an environmental management program. You're now working for GHD, leading the DFAT-funded Water for Women program. What about you? What's kept your passion for water and the environment over the years?
Thanks, Rosie. And I'm just going to have a slightly different tack to Navarra. I took a bit longer to get there. I started, as you say, in 1997 in Indonesia, but I had some 10 or 15 years before that. I graduated out of chemical engineering, so fluid and water was a big part of that. And then I actually joined a manufacturer. And that was actually where my first interest in the environment actually came from, was looking at, I won't mention the company, but working for one of those organizations and seeing what actually happens. So I then actually went back to university to study environmental engineering, and water and wastewater was a core part of that. I then moved to Australia and got involved in sort of water, wastewater, environmental areas on the domestic front at that point in time. And then in 1996, I got the opportunity to, as you say, work on a project, environmental management project in Indonesia, and I sort of never looked back from that. Obviously, dealing with the environment, you're dealing a lot with water. Opportunities then arose where I was able to bring that water piece back in. Looking at water safety planning, looking at actually my next project was in Bangladesh when a lot of that arsenic contamination was happening. So really got interested but could really see the plight of people when they don't actually have access to safe water. Yet so many inspiring stories that we could see that made differences to people's lives as we went. So it's actually then evolved from there. Done a whole range of different things in both urban supplies and rural supplies. And yes, in the late 2017, had the opportunity to take on the Water for Women Fund and work with all the different partners to really make that difference on the ground. So I feel very privileged and very lucky to have done that. And it's given me a lot of insights into people all the way around the world. That's how I keep my passion, because it's really about people. And you see the difference that you're making in people's lives, but probably even more importantly, the difference that they're making in their own lives, because it's us all actually working together. We might bring a bit of technology or a bit of thinking to them, but they've got to really pick it up and run with it. And for me, that's what actually keeps me really inspired and interested and committed to this sector.
The work you both do is all about changing people's lives through access to water, sanitation and hygiene. Navarra, we know that the water crisis is a gendered crisis, which of course means that it impacts differently on women and men, boys and girls. What examples can you give relating to everyone equally benefiting from access to water, sanitation and hygiene services, but also playing that essential key role in decision making?
Thanks, Michael. I guess, in terms of decision making, we recognize that as a, key part, especially in PNG, where you have, I'll give an example of, the community-based water community wash that we do. PNG, largely across maybe 90% of our community's culture, it's patrilineal. So men have naturally been, leaders not only in the home, but also in the community. So I guess it's been a case of kind of tweaking our process to try and increase that women's participation in decision making. So it can be little things about the processes that we're implementing. For instance, if it's a community wash project, we like to involve the community at the, engage them at the initial stages of any community wash project we do for sustainability, as well as, sustaining the outcomes afterwards. So it's been a case of, tweaking our processes where we encourage women's participation at the very beginning, where we work with the community to establish, say, community wash committees, and stress to them, first of all, the importance of gender and having women participate.
And Navarra, can I ask you, what sort of resistance, if any, do you get to these sorts of initiatives and these sorts of processes? And how do you overcome that resistance?
I think, men, I guess, at the beginning, the men would take the natural leadership role. If you're working in communities, they'd want to naturally, come and take the lead in this, but we try and address it in a kind of collaborative way where we talk to the communities first about why gender is important to us, why women, bear most of the burden of, water sanitation and hygiene, and why we want to increase women's participation in the process. So it's really a case of from the initial that engagement, with the community, really outlining what we're about and why it's important, and then taking them along on the journey and explaining to them. So, it's a process of getting them accustomed to, what we're about and why women's participation is so important. Yeah.
Alison, as hearing the work that Navara is describing in Papua New Guinea, and thinking about what you were talking before of what fuels your passion is seeing the work on the ground and the work from the partners within the Water for Women Fund. What are some of the lessons that you see that we can take from the work of Water for Women and your partners?
Great question, Rosie, and really building on what Navara has already said. I think some of the really key things that we are learning is it isn't just about involving women or people with disability. It's making sure that we involve everybody in the community. And as Navara has indicated, there oftentimes can be that resistance, but it is about having those conversations and understanding when to have those conversations together, but also when to have the conversation separately. Sometimes you do actually need to separate it out. And I think a great example is something like menstrual hygiene management, which is not something that we talk a lot about, even in Australia, openly. But by exploring those different conversations and bringing men and boys into those conversations at school or within the communities, COVID was a great example of where something like menstrual hygiene, the whole supply chain actually broke down. So it became a real issue to everybody. But having those conversations together in a classroom so people can really understand, boys and girls, what those issues are. It doesn't need to be a mystery. It's a very sort of natural part of life. So it's removing some of those taboos and traditional perspectives of that. But it's working together. But then there's times when you need to actually have those conversations separately, where it might be the women and what do they need, or the girls and what they need. So I think those are some of the really big things that we're learning, is when to have the appropriate conversations about an issue like that, but also some of those broader issues. I know there was some work done in Fiji a little while ago, and just picking up what Michael's question in terms of doing no harm and resistance. So it's having those conversations, even within some of the partner organizations themselves, where they need to understand their own biases or their own sort of perceptions of things that they actually didn't really know that they had. And so by them going through that process, they're going, oh, well, I didn't realize that was the impact I was having, or I didn't understand if I did that, it could be interpreted as that. So it's building on all of those different things and making sure those open conversations can be had.
Thanks, Alison. These are sometimes difficult conversations to have across a range of different themes, all of which might create sensitivities or be subject to certain biases in your stakeholders. So that's a very important message. Navara, Alison has raised the issue of how we continue these efforts through COVID. And of course, where you are in Papua New Guinea, you're in the middle now of a full-blown COVID crisis. So do you have any advice about how organisations like your own can navigate this twin crisis of water and COVID?
Thanks, Michael. And just probably going back to Alison's points about context. So Alison made a good point about different contexts will entail different approaches. So it's understanding the context as well, I guess. Just building on what Alison said, PNG has a different context across the board. There's so many different contexts to work in. So it's as implementers, it's understanding the context and what approaches to take when you work in those contexts. Coming back to your question on the COVID and WASH approach, well, I guess the fortunate thing about, not fortunate, but one opportunity that's come out of the COVID situation is that there's been more focus and more, especially from government, more resources put towards WASH and increasing WASH in the communities, as well as in the communities where we work in. So I guess working with COVID and WASH is just that access to water to practice good hygiene. So we've been fortunate where, the government has given more money to implementers to go out there and implement, say, in the towns, in hand washing stations for schools, or unfortunately in a emergency response, so you're looking for more quick kind of rapid response. So, funding could be there, say, for a water supply, but it might not be enough time to go and implement a full-on water supply unless you're already in that space. So you're looking at other solutions for increasing access. So I guess with water aid, we've kind of been, and I think other organizations as well, we've been implementing awareness or more promotion of low-cost, hand washing solutions. We have what we call a tippy-tap, which is it's a implement where it's like a construction of a tap, what you call a mobile tap, made out of ready-to-use or accessible materials. You get a container, you put it on a rack, so you could have water and bring it closer to your household. So we've been promoting, low-cost hand washing, those sort of solutions, to make it easier for places that don't have closer access to water to have greater access. So I think in PNG, for me, I think about the water issue. It's not about it's availability, but we have a lot of natural water resources. You have rivers, across the country, but its access is more the issue with us. Is how do you bring that available water closer to your for people to access. So you're looking at solutions for each context of how you bring that access closer. And I guess in the with COVID, with the emergency response, how do you do that quicker? So it's looking for the most appropriate and appropriate solutions for the situation and the context. Yeah.
Thanks, Navarra, very much for that. Alison?
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that. Thanks, Navarra. You captured so many of the important aspects of sort of WASH and COVID. And I think just building on that and taking that out more broadly, we did see that very much across the fund, that it was so well positioned to help respond to COVID, because water, hand hygiene, just even overall general health became such an important underpinning response to COVID. So while a terrible situation that we're all dealing with on a day-to-day basis, I think it has actually played a role in raising the importance of WASH as something that's fundamental to all development response, but also to humanitarian or to emergency response as well. So I think people have always known that to a certain degree, but I think it's really raised the profile and the need to really find the funding to support that, because without it, other things, we can't build on top of other things.
Thank you both very much for these fascinating reflections. I wanted to move on now to the question of water resource management and water for human development. So we know these two sets of issues and the responses to those issues are different, but they're completely and inextricably interlinked. So Alison, what are the interlinkages that you see between water for development and water resource management? And do you ever see the two conversations going on in parallel? And if so, isn't that a problem?
Thanks, Michael. Great question. And it's a conversation I've had quite a bit over the last couple of years. And I know it's an international conversation that's been going on for a number of years. So to answer your first question in terms of, do we see these conversations going in parallel? Absolutely. And they continue to happen in parallel, though I think there's quite a number of us kind of going, but this doesn't make any sense. Where do we find those touch points? How do we actually try and work together? They do often work at very different scales. You've got water resources that could be transboundary, sort of major river systems, whereas water and sanitation it often occurs more at sort of a catchment or localized level. But you can't separate the two, because a big water river system obviously ends up in a catchment that people are actually drawing water from. So I think we need to explore the issue, and maybe something at a catchment level starts to have those conversations. But areas where I really think they'll start to come together is climate change is one of those, the whole water security issue. I think gender and social inclusion is a really important aspect as well. How do you bring different people together to have those conversations? And I think it's actually creating the spaces to bring some of the water resource practitioners and the water water, sanitation, and hygiene practitioners together and facilitate those conversations. Make sure they actually understand each other's perspectives. I think we actually now do, but I think there's a misunderstanding that they can't actually work together, and I very much think that they can work together. And water and sanitation and hygiene is a small part of that whole water resource piece, but it's a really critical part of the water resource piece, and we need to just make sure that those conversations are happening. So I would say sort of climate change and gender social inclusion are two obvious touch points to start to explore some of those areas and have those joint conversations, because it's only when you have those you start to really find the solutions.
Alison, I think that's so powerful, as you say, bring those conversations together. And Navara, it'd be great to get a practical example from you. As Alison said, these conversations happen at an international level, a national level, and I know that you've been doing work at a district level with the government and East Sepik in thinking particularly around water security and how can the government get data, up-to-date data to help inform their water planning. Am I right? I think that the data that they had been using was rainfall data from the 1970s to plan their water plan in the district. So can you share a little bit of the practical work that you've been doing with the district government in Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, that's right. I think, with WaterAid here in our work, we take a very much system strengthening approach. So it's been kind of working with the government to improve their services and improve their processes. So, one of the key things that we take for granted is that they have the data to implement all that. So it's kind of raising their levels of the importance of data and assisting them in ways to, get the relevant data. So, but even with climate change, it's a newer area for it in the country, let alone a district level to work with. So it's slowly bringing them into that space by, first of all, direct them. So we've linked them, through our work with the Water for Women, we've linked them with the HART group. Rosie, you'll have to help me with the acronym for HART. It's they're a group of engineers that are doing kind of pro bono work in that climate space. So we've kind of linked them with the district government through our work with them, and they've kind of directed us in the right way, which data to be collecting to increase or see how we can have more, wash climate resilient wash systems. Yeah.
That's fantastic. It's so important, isn't it, to get that data into the hands of decision makers for the planning of sustainable water supplies. And of course, you've both raised the decision making and who gets to be around the table and the gendered nature of that across the region. You talked about Alison, and particularly you touched on Papua New Guinea and the 90% of Papua New Guinea being a patriarchal society. Navara, Alison, perhaps you can share a few of your thoughts on what you're seeing around who is making decisions on water resource allocation, and what are the things that you think we need to be doing to address that, to make sure that it is equitable and taking the views of men and women's perspectives.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rosie. I think oftentimes a lot of those water resource decisions, it's often made by engineers, and I'll take I'm one of them, but oftentimes they are men, although that's sort of changing sort of through the years. So but regardless of that, and I partly say that in jest, but oftentimes those kind of within, say, Department of Infrastructure or Department of Water Resources, they tend to be more male dominated historically, although again that's sort of changing. But at the same time, those tend to be the people around the table. The groups that we need to start to bring in are linking together those social implications as well, because we often deal with things as a sort of the infrastructure and the water bit, and then there's the people bit, and they all operate independently, and that there's not that connection actually between the two. And oftentimes we associate sort of women in some of those more social protection areas and men in those others, and that's very stereotypical, and it is changing, but it is the way that it is existing in so many different countries. So again, it's starting to actually change the conversation and bringing more parties in together, and really understanding you can't separate the water and the infrastructure from the people, and making sure that the voices of various people actually start to actually come together and look at what the solutions are going forward. And I think Navara touched on it, that whole system strengthening approach. And it is looking at it as a system. Within Water for Women, we're definitely looking at it. It's the water and the water and sanitation system, but I think it's edging out to bring in some of those more water security aspects as well, and climate change. I think we see such fragmentation right across where water is actually managed and where health and where sanitation is managed. And the only way, and I think climate change is really going to drive this, is to actually bring those different perspectives together. Again, which I've sort of said earlier, that's the only way we're going to actually try and find those solutions and get those different voices, because as getting those different perspectives, we can then start to find new ways of actually doing things.
Great, Alison. And Navara, did you want to build on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that Alison made, and I guess that I'm going back to Michael's question about where does water resource management and water washes, human development interlink, and Alison hit the nail on the head. I think it's bringing the users or the end beneficiaries into the conversation, and women being the people, the most who use and biggest end users of water and biggest beneficiaries of water, they need to be, I guess, involved in that conversation. And it's through these, our interventions that we can bring women into the conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, both of you. For any of us who work in international development, the work always involves a continuing dialogue between hope and fear. So I'd like to ask Alison first, what's the thing that worries you most about the current water crisis? And then what's the thing that gives you the most hope about our ability to manage the water crisis?
Great question. I like that question. I think the thing that worries me most is we're just moving too slowly. All these different competing agendas, and whether we call it power dynamics or politics, whatever word you want to actually choose, it just often gets in the way of actually us trying to make progress and do good things. It was kind of actually really interesting. My son, we were watching something on the AFL football the other night, and it was talking about racism. And he said, "Oh, this is why we're not doing more great things on the planet, because we're tied up in all these saying bad things about each other." And I just thought it was such a beautiful example of a sort of a young person's perspective. If we could actually look out for each other more and respect each other, we're going to be able to actually do more great things together. And if we can carry some of those thoughts to the future, then we're in safe hands. So I think that's where my hope then comes from. Well, I'm a bit worried about some things. I think my hope comes from the fact, even within the fund itself, we've got all these different partners working together. We might disagree on the approach or exactly what it is that we need to do, but we've got a common purpose, and we're working through those different roles and those different perspectives to try and move forward. And what we've started to be able to achieve in the fund by working together and bringing those different perspectives, women, disability, sexual and gender minority communities, other marginalized communities, the NGOs, government, private sector, all of those different things working together and listening to each other and working out how we can actually maximize those different perspectives to find more ideal solutions and to start to move faster. So it's those kind of things that actually give me hope. We're making little bits of progress. We'd love to be able to move faster, but I think we've started to really demonstrate if you do bring all those different voices together, whether that be at a fund level and talking to various partners around Australia and overseas, or actually within the country level, or actually at a community level. You bring those together, then people are innovative. We can actually try and find solutions, and that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, that conversation with your son gave me goose pimples. Navara, So you're sitting there in Papua New Guinea leading an incredibly complex but dynamic program, having an incredible impact. So what about for you? What worries you about the water crisis, and what does give you hope and drive your incredible work and passion every day?
Thanks, Rosie. I think I'd agree with Alison. It's just the rate at which we're moving. We're probably, the problem is so great that we're probably not moving at the right pace. And for me, it's just getting the government on board with that, because ultimately we need their support to drive it as a system. Taking a systems approach to driving and addressing these issues. So the government and not having prioritizing WASH, I guess, would be a reason for this, the slow rate. Agreeing with Alison. But I think the hope is that there's a lot of great work being done. And it's just about, demonstrating that, or really highlighting the evidence that, this can be done. These are the, outcomes that can come out of addressing WASH or for development. And there's a lot of great work being done. I guess it's just highlighting it in the same to the people in power, and also the advocacy is where our hope is to really emphasize the importance of WASH and what benefits it can bring. Yeah.
Amazing.
And Navara, do you think sometimes decision makers have trouble prioritising? There's just so much to do. Where do you start?
That's correct. I think with prioritising, then there's political influence that I've seen in PNG politics. They usually go for the quick fix, or what's the flavor of the day, for instance. Coming so near to elections, I'm using again government as an example. Their priorities lie in different areas. So in a way, it's kind of decorating it up as well. We can present our evidence, but how can it benefit, in a tangible way that will also be attractive to, say, whoever the political followers are. So, unfortunately, that's just the way politics works. And if you're working in a government system, it's how you utilize that. But ultimately, it's how do you make them see the importance and help them to get that support behind WASH. Yeah.
If I could just add to that too, great points, Navara. But I think what I want to add too, and again, we're really exploring this through the Water for Women Fund. We've started with a WASH program. We've brought that idea of we can actually use WASH as an entry point to look at gender and social inclusion, and really not just change people's lives from a service delivery of WASH services, but really change their involvement in decision making and their contributions to the community. But at another level, it's been really interesting, just the conversations we've had, even within DFAT or just more broadly within the sector. All of a sudden, the water teams and the WASH teams are talking to, the water resources people, we're talking to the health people, the education, the gender branch as well. So actually bringing all those different things together, it's been a really, again, interesting conversation. We keep coming back to the conversation, but it's active conversations. People are actually recognizing, if you start off with that water and sanitation piece, there's so many other flow-on benefits that come from that. So it's expanding it out, and it's just not a single solution. And I think that as people start to recognize that, hopefully then people start to invest at that level, but then they're getting all the other benefits that go along with that as well. So I just wanted to add that in as well.
And it just starts to become obvious.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it is going back to, reflecting on the story at the beginning that I shared of Dorothy in Papua New Guinea. That's how she experiences water in her life, isn't it? That opportunity that then opens up for education and health and livelihood activities. And that's how we need to be approaching and thinking about development, water for development. And that's what you both have done such an incredible job in this conversation, in this episode, Navarre and Alison, to really bring that complexity into some really concrete examples around water for development and around particularly the human side of it, but also the interlinkages with water security. So I hope that everyone has enjoyed listening to this third episode in the Goodwill Hunters Winter Series on the water for development. Look out for our next episode in the series, where we'll be exploring what happens when climate change, conflict and water security collide, with none other than Malcolm Turnbull and Howard Bamsey. Thanks, everyone.